the question this morning is about creation versus evolution. So if you ever the phrase biting off more than you can chew was used to apply to a Sunday morning topic, that would be for this one. As we're going to take a look at creation versus evolution, and I have 3 points I'm going to give you, because that's what good preachers do. But we're going to look at Genesis 1. And really my first 2 points are kind of like precursors leading up to that. My third point, we're going to look at Genesis 1. But we'll start by reading it together here this morning. I want to read the whole chapter, so just go with me if you've got it. Page 1 for most of you. It's easy to find. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind, and God saw that it was good. There was evening, and there was morning, a third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the true great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." There was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, and shall be food for you. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. By the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. All right, so let me begin by saying that there are numerous ministries that speak about this very issue. These ministries have entire websites, a huge staff, countless authors and scientists, whole bookstores and exhibits created to address this issue of creation versus evolution. So I would be a fool to try to reproduce that this morning. And I have been accused of being a fool, but not this morning. So, so I'm boiling it down, like I said before, 3 simple points that I pray will be helpful for us. And then I would encourage you beyond that to check out those ministries in order to dive into this topic further. You could literally spend your lifetime investigating this topic and never cease to be amazed at what you would discover. So with that being said, let me give you my 3 simple points. And again, the third one will really jump us into Genesis 1. First point is this. There is no scientific discovery anywhere that disproves creation or the Bible. No scientific discovery anywhere that disproves creation or the Bible. It's just has not been found. Now, if you said the other opposite, you can also say that, and I'll give you a point behind that, but there are some things that kind of make you question about sort of the length of time and age of the earth. There are many cases that would make you think about the long time required for evolution. I'm hesitant to even give examples because literally you just keep going. I mean, again, people devote their whole lifetime to these things. But there's a few things. Discovered a dinosaur bone, which is supposed to be millions of years old, with living blood cells in it. Well, how did those blood cells stay alive for millions and millions of years? You think about the Grand Canyon, which is supposed to take a long time to be formed, and when Mount St. Helens erupted, it created really a mini Grand Canyon, very similar, all the same types of features to the Grand Canyon, and it did it in a matter of months to be formed. So you see that it can happen quickly. Well, one I remember reading about in particular, I was trying to find the book I read it in, but it talked about the saltiness of the oceans. And the oceans are actually continually getting saltier. And if the oceans had been around for millions and millions of years, they would actually be so salty they wouldn't be able to contain life. Because the water continues to cycle through as the water does, but the salt remains and stays there. So just a couple examples. Again, not trying to overwhelm you with examples. There's a ton out there. But having said, just giving some of these, let me say this, that neither creation nor evolution can be scientifically proven. Because for something to be scientifically proven, it has to be reproducible. And no one has been able to reproduce the creating of the earth. It just hasn't happened, and as much as people want to. It just doesn't fit. It just doesn't work that way. So creation, we have to recognize creation and evolution are both theories. They're both just theories. One is a theory from people guessing what it was like, and another theory comes from the only eyewitness who was there, God. He was there. Now people could say, well, these aren't God's words. In Genesis, that's some one person's idea, a myth account. We can look into those, but we can look, if we're just talking about creation versus evolution, there's someone was there to create it, and we can listen to what they said, if we know, or someone wasn't there to create it, and we just come up with theories. So behind that, when we talk about God's Word, it's important to recognize this. God's Word is not a science book. And the purpose of God's Word is not written so we could study science. But having said that, nowhere does God's Word contradict good science. It just doesn't. It lines up with God's Word. So sometimes we think about this conflict like they're dual. Like you either have to have faith or you have to believe in science. You can't believe in both. But they just don't contradict each other. I know that there's a lot of teaching, a lot of textbooks, a lot of things you've heard in classes even that would say otherwise, but it's just not true. Now, being able to defend that, I have to define our terms. We talk about science or even evolution. There are 2 kinds of them. There's 2 kinds of science. There's probably more of them, but I'm simplifying it. So historical science would be the science of looking back in history and trying to figure out what might have caused what we see today. That would be historical science. And evolution, the theory of evolution would fit in this category. You're taking what we see here and say, well, I think what I see here, I can explain it by this, and this. And those are unreproducible events. You can't do that experiment to see if your theory is right. You just have to go off the theory. And you can create a whole bunch of different theories. And I'll talk even about some of those related to God's Word. Now contrast it with observational science. Observational science is probably what you think when you think about like your chemistry class, like with test tubes and chemicals, and you have put a milliliter of this in with a centimeter of that, I don't know, a liter of that, and it does. So think about like Coke and baking soda, right? You put it together, you know what happens? Go try it. And you can do it a second time, you can do it a third time, you can do it hundreds of times, and you should get the same result. It's reproducible. And that's observational science. You can, right? I remember when in elementary school, did you ever do where you did the coin flip 100 times, and you had to see like how many times you heads and tails? They don't do that anymore. I did. Okay, you did. Okay. So I was saying, like, you can observe it and you can do it, and everyone in the class can do it 100 times, and you can say, okay, what does this look like? And you get a feel for how that works. Observational science has helped us in our lives countless ways. I mean, think of all the different medicines, the different technology we have. All of that has come out of observational science and been very, very helpful. So that's also true with evolution. So we could talk about macroevolution, and that would be making large changes, like going from one species to another, like a cat changing to a dog, for example. And there are no documented cases of macroevolution. No one has ever seen it. Again, there's theories of like where there's this place where this jump happened or things like that, but it's not ever been seen. Now that's different than microevolution, which we have lots of examples of. Those are minor changes which happen as a result of influences from our culture, from our surroundings around us. The real famous one was Darwin when he was at the Galapagos Islands and he discovered the finches, if you guys are familiar with that. And there are all these finches that had different beaks. Some were like short and thick, and some were kind of longer and skinnier. They were all finches, and that was often an argument for evolution. And that is evolution. That's microevolution. So these islands had different needs, so the birds sort of adapted to their needs. So some needed to get into rocks, in narrow places, so their beaks would kind of start to grow longer and get to that place. Again, this is a theory, can't reproduce it. Others were shorter and harder because they needed to crack open hard seeds to get to, or things like that. So there's an example. I would actually put skin tones as an example of microevolution. Now, this doesn't mean it happened. It takes a really long time, but you think about those who, for generations, have come from hotter climates, like Africa, for example, have darker skin tone. Well, our skin needs different things when we're constantly getting beat down by the sun. It needs to respond in different ways. Think about people like Norwegians, in the cold climates, how white their skin is. Well, these are things that have adapted because of climates from skin color. When I moved to Indiana for 4 years to go to college, I found myself beginning to talk with a central Indiana accent. It's a really distinctive accent. It's not a southern accent, but it's definitely not northern. And I don't know if you guys have ever go down to Kentucky for a couple of weeks on vacation or something, and you start saying y'all and stuff. So that's like a kind of a weird example of microevolution. You start to adapt to your surroundings. And so, yeah, I mean, you see that all the time. So it's important when you talk about like science or evolution, like what are you talking about exactly and what that means. So that all is under the first point. There is no scientific discovery anywhere that disproves creation or the Bible. And under that means neither creation nor evolution can be scientifically proven. They're both theories. And also God's word is not written to be a science book, but it also doesn't contradict good science. Okay? First point. Second point is this. Creation versus evolution is not a salvation issue. That's very important to remember because we can get really heated about it, or some people can, in the church. You can believe in evolution and still get to heaven through trusting in the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's plenty of people who believe in evolution. We die believing in Jesus. We get to heaven. We'll be with them someday, and then we can talk about who's right or not. It'll be pretty obvious at that point. But let me tell you what creation versus evolution is. It is an issue of how we view the Bible. And this can be an important thing sometimes. Now, clearly you're getting my bias. If you want someone else's bias, you can go somewhere else. But there really is no room for evolution in the Bible. And many theories throughout history have been created to try and make them sort of fit together. And let me just give you a few of them. So like theistic evolution would be an example. So that would be saying, yeah, evolution happened, but God was the one who made it happen. Like God just used the evolutionary process for that to happen. And so you're saying, okay, so that's, God's still getting the glory for that. That would be one example. Another would be what they call the day gap theory. So we read the biblical account of creation. And so when you read that, instead, after maybe all of the days or some of the days, there was these gaps, like huge gaps, where a whole bunch of stuff happened. And then there'd be another day. And then a whole bunch of stuff happened. A similar one to that would be a day equals not a literal day, but an era, or a long period of history. So in the first day, you can see like all of these things were happening, and it took millions of years for that. That was the first day was the Big Bang, right? So you have something came into being, and that took a long time. And then the second day was a really long time. Now, there are problems with all of these theories. I don't have to go into the details of them, but let me tell you what I think is the biggest problem with all of them, which I think is really getting to the heart of the issue, is that they're all attempt to fit God's word into man's theory. And this is what I really think is the heart, is with what are we going to start? Where do we start? Where is we say this is the truth, and our world will fit around it. If you hear about the concept of worldview, or we all have lenses, we have filters. Well, what we determine as truth is what changes our filter. That's why two people can experience something. Let's talk about like a healing, for example. So two people can experience a healing. One person, they're looking at the exact same evidence, and one person will say, well, God healed this, God did this. And the other person will say, well, the medicine did this, or the doctor did this. Well, because it's the perspective is saying, the filter is saying, well, this isn't allowing this to happen. So with what are we going to start? Well, we start with God's word, and then evaluate man's ideas into it. I would argue that's a good way to start. How does man's idea compare to God's word? Is that our starting point? Or is our starting point man's ideas? So here's man's idea. It says, man's idea is, well, maybe evolution. Let's try that theory out. Well, okay, if we go with that theory, then I have to kind of make God's word say this, or make it fit in this way, or make it work this way. And so to me, that is really the issue. What are we starting with? And we're going to start with what we value the most. So what do we value the most? Now, you think about just a practical life situation. You've seen this example with the jar and the rocks. You guys seen that? Done a youth group or something? You got big rocks, and then little pebbles, and then sand, and then water. If you put them in that order, you can fit everything in. Well, what are the big rocks, in essence? What are the things that we value the most? That's what should go in our life the most. That's also what we build our worldview on, the things we value the most. So just a little life thought question for us. So the second thing then, creation versus evolution is not a salvation issue. That's my second point. It is an issue of how we view the Bible. And we're going to start with what we value the most. Okay, that takes us to my third point then, which is this. Creation makes much of God, and evolution makes little of God. Creation makes much of God, evolution makes little of God. I had fun doing this. Go through chapter 1, and what do you learn about from God, from creation, in the Genesis 1 account? What do we learn from God? Well, we learn that God is creator, and that's kind of an obvious one. In the beginning, God created, it says, and so we see God is creator. Beyond that, we learn that God is powerful. I say that because he just speaks and it happens. He doesn't have to do some incantation or a major thing or get a bunch of bulldozers to pull stuff together. He just speaks and it happens. So it speaks to God as powerful. I also see that here that God is tender and caring. And you say, well, okay, just the way he dealt with creation, am I making that up? But it actually comes from verse 2. It says, when the earth was formless and void, darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving or hovering over the surface of the waters. One other place that word is used, it's very few actually, is in Deuteronomy 32, and it describes an eagle, mother bird, kind of hovering over or being over her baby birds. She's like protecting, like hovering over them, watching over them. And when I looked at that, I was like, wow, I never really thought about it. For the Spirit of God is just like watching over. It's the very beginning of creation. Really, it's even before day one, God said, verse 3, let there be light. But even before that, the Spirit of God is hovering over, watching over. So I just got that picture, just tender and caring like a mother. So God is tender and caring. I think we also learned, this is a big one, that God interacts. God interacts. So he creates and then he sees. So he speaks something in creation, and then he doesn't just kind of leave it. If you notice, he creates something. I mean, there's a lot of, verse 4, God saw that the light was good. And then every time he created something, he just kind of created and walk away. He created, and then he observed it. He's like, oh, this is neat. This is good. This is a neat thing. So he's interacting. He's responding. He's also separating and making distinctions. So it says, God separated the light from the darkness. He separated the upper waters from the lower waters. So again, he's not just kind of creating and saying, yeah, that was fun, I'm moving on. But he's actually like interacting with creation. Another really cool verse, verse 17. He's placing things in their proper position. So it's talking specifically about the stars. One of the just radical things to think about is the last part of verse 16. God's talking about this, making the sun and the moon, and then he made the stars also. You know how many stars there are in an entire universe? Like just that's like an afterthought. Oh, he made that too. In verse 16. And then 17 says that God placed them, the sun, the moon, and the stars, in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. He placed them. Sometimes I get this picture of God just taking like a handful of stars and just like whipping them out in the sky. But then he's like, no, this should be over here, and this over here. And you know, if I put the moon here and the sun here, like every once in a while they're going to get this cool eclipse thing. And so he's like, nah, I've got to move it just a little bit over here. And even you think about the earth itself, like if it was just a little bit closer to the sun or a little bit farther from the sun, earth, we would not be able to live here the way that we know life. So that sense of God placing. So again, he's interacting with creation. I think a really cool thing. Another cool thing you see all throughout, but is that God is a relational and a communicator. Primarily in verse 26 you see this, but God, first of all, he's relating and communicating with himself, which is crazy. The whole concept of the Trinity, verse 26, God said, let us make man in our image. Well, who's he talking to? We've got the concept of God, one God in three persons. That's something that is always really hard to grasp. In fact, other religions say, well, you worship multiple gods. Well, because they think they see Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But one God, three persons. Why would God could be whatever he wants to be because he's God. Why did he do it in a way that there would be three persons? Because he's a relational God, because he communicates. And even within himself, he doesn't need us, because he has, within the Trinity, there's communication and relationships. But he also relates and communicates with us. So when he created, he created male and female, he said to them in verse 20, he spoke to us. He's interacting with us. He's having a relationship with us. And then he created us. We see more in chapter 2, in that account of creation. He created us to relate to one another, to man and woman to relate to one another. So God is relational. God is a communicator. We see this from creation. What else do we see from creation? God names. God calls something. He proclaims something to be what it is. God called the light. Okay, God called the light day, verse 5. He called the darkness night, in verse 5. Verse 8, God called the expanse heaven. He's naming things. He's saying, this is what you are. This is your identity. And he does that for us today. He calls us, not just sort of this like spiritual experience that I've received the call, but he names us. Our name and our identity comes from God. He's proclaiming us to be who we are. God names. He also blesses and gives. You see at the end of the chapter, he blessed humanity. And he says, I've given you all this food to eat. I'm a generous God. I'm going to give you what you need. I bless you. And then God completes. And that was at the beginning of chapter 2. We're talking about the seventh day. God rests in his completeness because it's perfect. And just like Jesus on the cross proclaiming, it is finished. It was a work that was done. God did on day 7. He said, it is finished. It is perfect. I can rest. Not because he was tired, not because he needed rest, but because it was complete. It was done. And then God sanctifies. As the one who is holy, God is holy, he sets apart and makes holy. He is in the unique position to do that. He can set apart a day and call it holy. He can set apart a people and call it holy. So we learn a lot about God from creation and from that creation account. And what do we learn about God from evolution? Well, we can still say that God is creator, again, if we take theistic evolution. But to me, it just doesn't quite seem as powerful. Now, I will say that if you go with theistic evolution, that God actually had to do a whole bunch of little miracles along the way, because every step that something had to evolve requires God to step in and do it, or it couldn't happen. I mean, just if you do statistic probability, it just couldn't happen without God. So if you're like, yeah, God did that, and then he did that, and then did that, you could get some glory from God. But he just does seem less powerful. Instead of speaking, and it happens, it takes millions of years for the process to happen. Could God do it that way? Yeah, he's got eternity. He's got all the time. But it just doesn't quite seem as powerful for God to do it that way. Doesn't mean he can't do it that way, but just comparing the two. I think God also seems more standoffish in evolution, if that's a word. It's kind of like, I'll get things started, but I'm just going to kind of wait here for a long time and just kind of wait and see what happens. I'm not going to be as involved. They talk about God interacting. I just don't see that as much in the evolutionary process. I think the process of evolution also just appears less personal. We don't actually really stand apart from animals in evolution. We actually come from animals. So we don't really have a unique relationship from any other animal other than we're the last ones to evolve. It's sort of like when kids, when they get a new toy, like that's their new favorite toy until they get the next toy, and now that's their favorite. And even if we're talking about relating to God in an evolutionary standpoint, well, the next time, as soon as the next thing gets evolved, what are we? We're just like the old toy on the shelf. It doesn't really give us a sense of personhood or uniqueness of how God created us. So it just seems less personal in that way. And in evolution, God is never really finished. There's no resting. There's no sense of completeness or perfection. It's just like trying to make the product better and better as you go. And we try, we've got to get to version 2.0, and you never finish. You never rest. And I just wonder sometimes if in our own the way that we act, that we're constantly at motion, constantly having to do something and prove something. Is it because we're trying to think like it's not finished? We're not resting in the finished work of Christ, but we're trying to finish the work ourselves. I'm not trying to overstate the case. Obviously, I'm biased. You're getting that perspective. But just tell me, of those two scenarios, which one makes more of God? Which one glorifies God more? I would say creation makes much of God, and evolution makes little or less of God. So I want us to recognize these things about creation. First of all, creation does not contradict science. They're not at odds against each other, no matter how many different things you hear that. Creation lines up with God's word. It fits. It makes a lot of sense. But creation, probably most importantly, creation makes much of God. It makes much of God. So if you leave here today with greater confidence in God's creation and all that can be discovered about it through science, that's a good takeaway. Go study science and see how God's creation fits in it. It's amazing. If you leave with greater confidence in God's word, not having to fear that, someday maybe somebody's going to discover something that's going to undermine my faith, that's a good takeaway too. But both of those pale in comparison to the need for us to make much of God. Not because he needs us to, not because he's just sitting around waiting for us to make much of him, but because that's the purpose from which we've been created. Creation makes much of him. The Bible makes much of him. And God is calling us to make much of him this morning.